Now, if Andy Burnham and his team were after a primer on the state of the UK economy, the challenges, the risks, the opportunities ahead, he could hardly do better than a couple of reports that have just landed. Really important reports, one for the Bank of England and another from the Office for Budget Responsibility about kind of the state of the public finances. We'll start with the OBR one first. And overshadowing this is a massive kind of trend, a change for the UK economy. And that is this: we have an ageing population in this country. What this is showing you basically is the ages of people across the UK population, kind of more or less now, so from younger through to older, and the median age at the moment is about 40. You can see, look, as you get towards kind of people being 90 or 100, there's far fewer of them for obvious reasons. But look at the lump and look at the shape here. That is the shape of the UK population right now. And now I'm going to kind of do a fast forward on to 2075, so what it'll look like in 2075. And have a look at this. You can see how it shifts over this way. And what does that mean? It means the kind of median age goes up. It goes up from about 40 to getting on to 50, about 49. And you can see there are fewer young people around and more older people around. And that has a massive bearing for the UK economy for all sorts of reasons, which we're going to go into now. And kind of in short, basically, if there's fewer younger people around, that's fewer people paying tax and working. More old people means you need to pay more for the welfare state and pay more for pensions. And that has a massive bearing for the public finances for the UK. But by the way, talking about population, here's another way of looking at it. Okay, so this is the UK population going back to 1975. That starts at 55 million. And you can see how it's kind of gone up and up and up. And where we're heading in the future, look at where we're heading. So that is the official projection. And you can see it, can't you? You can see there's a point here, about 2055, give or take a few years, where we have kind of peak population, and then it starts to kind of go down. And it's worth just saying, you know, if it was not for immigration, which is a big part of this, then actually the line would already be starting to fall. Okay, so without migration, without net migration, that would already be going down. And so we're at this kind of turning point. In fact, we're kind of pretty much at it right now, where in terms of the natural population without migration, that's about to come down. But even when you include migration, it looks like it's going to peak in a few decades' time, and that's quite a lot of migration. And as I say, that has a bearing on everything else. And why does it do that? It's because this is showing you the public finances. So that the red line there is how much we spend as a state. You can see that's COVID, obviously, enormous kind of amount of money going out there. And the black line is revenues, so that's tax revenues for the most part. And look at where things potentially might head in the future. And this is the main thing. So the OBR, the Office of Budget Responsibility, every year they look at the long-term projection for the public finances to get a sense of, you know, what are those big forces at play here. And spending looks like it's going higher and higher because you've got to spend more on the welfare state, you've got to spend more on the NHS, you've got to spend more on pensions on the basis of current policy. And we'll get onto that in a second. Things like the triple lock are going to come into this. But revenues, the actual amount coming in, that barely goes up. And you can probably kind of glean the issue here. As the years go on, the gap between those two widens. And as the gap widens, that means you have a bigger budget deficit. You're borrowing more each year. And as that accumulates, then you have more debt as a nation. And that's kind of where the UK, where it looks like the UK is heading, I should say. And that debt, okay, I'll give you the kind of the historical perspective of what we're talking about here, because this is the national debt going back to 1900, okay? And there you can see, there's World War I, there's World War II, two big peaks there, okay? Up to kind of, you're getting over a 200% of GDP, a lot of money in the scheme of things. This is where we are at the moment. You can see how it's kind of accumulated there. You've got the crisis, the financial crisis there, you've got COVID there, going up and up and up. Well, here is where they thought, so the last time the OBR did one of these exercises, it was a couple of years ago, this is where they thought it was heading. I mean, it's pretty striking, isn't it? The national debt going higher and higher and higher because you're spending more, basically, and not getting more in taxes. They've just updated those numbers. So this is the thing that I think, you know, for the Burnham campaign and for everyone else is really significant. This is where those latest numbers show that we're heading, you know, really high. And here's what's particularly scary. You know, if you have a sequence, as we've had in the recent years, of economic shocks, and if that affects interest rates, well, look at what happens. Actually, we have to kind of change the axis here, just so you get a sense of that. If you have a series of economic shocks, then you could be heading for a national debt heading on for kind of like 1,000% of GDP. I mean, it's just a projection, but it gives you a sense of the numbers that we're talking about, which would be bigger than anything, either in peace or in wartime. Look, there's World War II, World War One, and there's that. But obviously, it's just an illustration. And it's worth just saying, okay, so the numbers we're talking about here, which are the kind of central figures, they do assume that the government is going to carry on paying out extra pensions uprated in line with the triple lock, and they also assume that the point at which you have to start paying taxation, so the threshold, this stuff we talk about quite a lot, that they also go up in line with earnings. If you don't do that, and this is kind of interesting, if you actually say, okay, we're going to raise those increments in line with CPI rather than everything else, in line with inflation, it's a very different story. Then the national debt goes down. Everyone ends up paying more tax. Pension contributions aren't as much. But actually, look, the national debt no longer looks so terrifying, does it? So it's worth just saying, we see these kind of apocalyptic lines every so often. Everyone gets very scared about them. There is a pathway which would be very different, but that pathway would involve potentially more fiscal drag, so there's more people being dragged into higher tax, and also potentially less generous pensions. And when it comes to pensions, okay, this is showing you where pension spending are kind of due to head in the future. So again, it's going out to 2075, and it's just an illustration. But if you have the triple lock, which basically says, we're going to pay you the highest of either earnings, inflation, or 2%, look, this is where it heads. This is where it would head if you just said, okay, it's just going to be average earnings. This is where it would head if you said, no, pensions are going to go up in line with inflation, which a lot of people would say is kind of maybe fair enough. It's a totally different story, isn't it? But so controversial. So you've got that issue, which is you've got the changing nature of the UK population, the ageing population. But also you have the issue that the economy has just not been growing that fast recently. And here is a really good illustration of that, which goes back to the 1760s. I know you probably like long-run charts. This is showing you economic growth cumulatively in the period up to kind of 1800. Not that much economic growth. But just look, over time, you go through the Industrial Revolution, you can see growth is picking up through the Industrial Revolution. The mid-19th century growth is getting stronger as you have more mechanization. And you can see that there it is kind of up into World War I, between interwar period, and then the extraordinary post-war growth. The glory era for UK economic growth there. But look at where we are now. That's just recently up until the financial crisis. Look at where we are now. Just look at that. That's the growth that we've had in recent years, this era that we're in at the moment. And if you look at that era, and if we zoom out, you should compare it to the other eras here, this is the weakest era that we've had for UK economic growth, going back all the way to this period. Some people talk about it being the worst since the Napoleonic Wars. It's actually worse since before the Napoleonic Wars. It's the worst since kind of US independence era, so 250 years. This is one of the issues facing the UK, and the weaker growth is, the less tax revenue there is coming in. And it's worth just saying, it's not just weak by historical standards, it's quite weak internationally. So this is showing you UK economic growth back in the 1940s, 1970s. And here's the striking thing about this. Look at this bar. That's the UK, and that is Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, the USA. Look at the red line. That's where the UK is in comparison with everyone else. So we're kind of doing all right back in the 1940s in terms of the height of the bars. But then look in the period, 1970s and 2007, the UK was one of the stronger regions in the world. Yeah, the bars are lower, but the UK is pretty high compared with everyone else. Now look at the era that we're in at the moment, and look how much lower the bars are. So everyone is growing more slowly, but critically, the UK is one of the slowest growing economies. So you've got weaker growth, you've got problems demographically, or challenges demographically, I should say. And then the other issue for the UK, and this is where the Bank of England research comes in, they're looking at artificial intelligence, this big issue. Some people think it might be a bubble, but certainly it's a boom for places like America, which has this growth which is stronger than almost everyone else. And they're comparing AI in the UK versus elsewhere. And have a look at this, okay? So this is showing you basically the percentage of the stock markets in various different countries around the world where AI stocks, so tech stocks, making chips, all those kinds of things, where that's a big deal. You can see the US over there, Taiwan, South Korea, and this is back in 2022. And over time, this is the percentage of those stock markets accounted for by AI stocks. Look at how those bars get higher and higher as time goes on, to the extent that in the latest numbers, which we've just kind of got through from the Bank of England, In the US, in Taiwan, in South Korea, AI accounts for 50% of all quoted companies, and it is massive economic growth, bringing in more money, bringing in more taxes, bringing more of everything else. And then look at the UK. So way down compared with everyone else. So you put it all together, you put that story about AI, are we missing the boom? The story about demographics, the story about the public finances, and there are all sorts of enormous economic challenges facing the next Prime Minister. The question I think people are going to be wondering is, does he recognise that, and what is he going to do about it?